2 Corinthians 2:16 presents us with a couple of very interesting translation issues. One is if in places in the verse you go word for word, it's senseless. But the other is there's a really nice concordance happening, but it's hard to keep the concordance in English. Let's take a look at this. Paul says that on the one hand, to some, understood we are, a fragrance of death into death, but on the other hand, to some, fragrance out of life into life. And for these things, who is sufficient? Well, let's start with osme. It means fragrance, aroma, something like that. But here's the problem. You want to keep the concordance if you can, but fragrance of death and fragrance of life. Well, we don't really talk about fragrance of death, right? Perhaps like the CSB has aroma, the NAT went to odor, but you don't really think of a fragrance or aroma of death, do you? But the problem is you get down here and you have the aroma of life, and fragrance and aroma really works. But the Net Bible, see what they did? They broke concordance and they said odor, and they shifted to fragrance. And you can see in the footnote that they're explaining what they're doing. But this is just a case where if you say a fragrance of death, that just really isn't English. But you don't want to break the concordance, but sometimes you have to. Interesting illustration. I think that if I had to make a decision on this, I would probably, like the NET, break concordance, because we talk about the stench of death. The stench of death and the fragrance of life. And I'm always going to go with meaning over concordance. So I would think stench would be my choice here. But the other thing I wanted to point out is this odd, out of death into death. And the NRSV, along with the NASB and the ESV, simply say from death to death. Now, what's the problem with that? It's not English. It doesn't mean anything. And this is the problem of these more word-for-word translations. They'll put the words in there. It just simply doesn't mean anything. And they'll say, well, you can kind of figure it out. Well, kind of the point of translation is to convey the meaning, right? So out of death into death, out of life into life, it just doesn't make any sense. And so you'll see some of the translations trying to help you. And the CSB is the aroma of death leading to death, and the aroma of life leading to life. The NIV, the aroma that brings death, and the aroma that brings life. But once again, we're left with this difficult option of, if we simply go word for word, I would argue it just doesn't mean anything. And translation should mean something. You simply can't go word for word all the time. Sometimes you have to figure out what the original author meant, out of death into death. I mean, it's pretty obvious what it is, right? Out of and leading into. Out of life that leads into life. But you just can't say from death to death or from life to life. It just doesn't make sense. But anyway, welcome to the joys of translation. A lot of translation is compromise. And you can do something here, and that means you can't do something in that same verse. I mean, you can't stay with the words if you want to have clear meaning. And translation is a lot of compromise, but that's just the nature of language.